and thank you very much. Dear friends, I'm delighted to be here as well. And I think it's a very important topic that we're going to discuss today. And what I would like to do with you is to share a few thoughts of how there are interlinkages between domestic and intimate partner violence and the empowerment of women and girls, and how also when women and girls, they try to exercise their rights, economic, social, and political rights, in order to leave abusive relationships and in order to address the hardships they have at home and in intimate partner relationships, the fact that they have to face more violence, more sexual harassment, both in public spaces and also in workspaces, how this really makes it even more difficult for them to exercise the economic, social, and political rights. I think in order to start, it's very important to understand that violence against women and girls, it really occurs in a continuum. And this statement recognizes the fact that there are commonalities between different forms of violence against women and girls, that they happen both in private and public spaces. And such violence manifests and seeks to perpetuate inequality. Systematic gender inequality, discrimination, and unequal power relations between men and women are recognized as the root causes of violence against women and girls. And that's why it's exactly important that economic and political empowerment of women and girls is important to eliminate such violence. Of course, also sanctions against perpetrators are also equally important. Evidence shows that low economic and social status of women are factors that they may increase the risk of violence that these women may face. We know that so far the experience of intimate partner violence is a significant barrier to women's access, equal treatment, and opportunities in economic and political life. And as a result, it impedes women's empowerment and economic independence. On the other hand, increasing economic independence is important to help survivors leave abusive relationships. Women's access to work and economic resources has the potential to prevent violence against women in family and intimate relationships through increased negotiating power and economic means to support themselves to leave abusive relationships. Of course, such efforts should be undertaken in parallel with efforts to prevent and respond to the violent behaviors of men against women. We have now some increased data that shows that women's engagement in paid work and ownership of property are associated with significant reductions on some occasions in marital violence. However, we really have to examine the other side, that when women, they try to have access exactly to employment or to economic resources, to exercise their rights, they also have to face very serious impediments of violence against them. We know that women's and girls' mobility, for example, and therefore also their access to economic, social, and the political life in general, is impacted by sexual harassment in public spaces, including in streets and public transportation. When they have access to education, we know that there is violence, sexual harassment in educational sectors, but also in workplaces. And particularly, I have to raise your attention particularly to the sexual harassment that women and girls, they face in public spaces. And I'm saying that because it's a form of violence against women and girls that it's not very well documented yet. We have very limited data, and also the legal frameworks that addressing sexual harassment and violence against women and girls in public spaces, it's very, very limited. And when women, they have to access workplaces and they have to access employment, we have more sexual harassment and violence against them that really impedes their access to such employment and to facilitate the economic empowerment. Again, we have some limited data about the sexual harassment and violence against women and girls in the world of work, but some data in 2014 from in the European Union, it shows that 55% of women have experienced sexual harassment at least once since the age of 15. And of these women, 32% reported that the perpetrator was somebody from the employment context, such as a colleague, supervisor, or a client. I think we've seen so far that in order to address such a complex phenomenon as violence against women and girls, we really need to have a comprehensive approach. That it does include laws and policies, not only addressing violence against women and girls in both public and private spaces, but also addressing discrimination against women in other areas of law. For example, in family and personal status laws that regulate the custody of children or the divorce processes, which very often really are impediments for women to live abusive relationships. Such a comprehensive approach also needs to include strategies to address the root causes, gender inequality, the social norms, practices, and behaviors that condone such violence against women and girls, and also discrimination against them. And of course, we need to have in place comprehensive and multi-sectoral coordinated services to survivors, and especially with a focus on having a longer-term support to survivors, which is still a very big gap in supporting survivors in the aftermath of the violence they experienced. And it's also very, very important to improve the methodologies for collecting data that will give us more information about the causes of such violence, the impact, in order to inform laws, policies, and programs in a solid way. UN Women, in partnership with other UN agencies, civil society, we are trying exactly to adopt this comprehensive approach and to help governments have in place laws and policies, strategies to prevent such violence, services for survivors, and data collection processes in line with international standards in order to address violence against women and girls. Just to give you one example, UN Women has developed together with the UNFPA a global program which is called Essential Services Package for survivors, for women and girls who experienced violence before, in order to help governments to have multi-sectoral services for survivors in a coordinated approach, and to help governments to have minimum standards in the sectors of health, the judicial sector, policing, the health sector, to help survivors. We have already rolled this program out in 10 countries, and we have 35 countries that they are self-starters. And I have distributed some of the material. You can have more information. Although responses to survivors, for obvious reasons, has been the main focus of responses of governments and other stakeholders to the needs of survivors, for obvious reasons, because we need to address the immense needs that survivors have in the aftermath of such violence, addressing the root causes of such violence has been a major policy and programmatic gap around the world. UN Women has contributed within the UN system and beyond to address this gap. And back in 2015, UN Women led the development of the first ever UN prevention framework, together with 6 other UN agencies, to help the UN system to develop a shared understanding of what prevention of violence against women and girls means, and what strategies it should entail in order to have sustainable results in eliminating violence against women and girls. In our approach, it's also, we consider very important to build the capacity of local authorities in order to collect data on violence against women and girls, because although it has been some considerable progress, we already see that there are some considerable gaps, and we need to strengthen more uniform methodologies among the different countries in order to be able to compare the data that we collect from different countries. I don't think I have any time left, so I would like to also give the opportunity to have a discussion, question and answers later. Thank you very much.
I'd like to begin by acknowledging Maria Gargiulo, wave Maria, and Arendra Venegas in Nicaragua, who are equal partners in this project. In developing countries, victims of gendered violence face restricted choices about their own safety. And the literature is full of the reasons why: poverty, cultural restrictions on women's employment, a lack of education, lack of adequate health care, lack of knowledge and limited access to legal options, corruption in the criminal justice system. In rural areas in developing countries, there's also limited access to social services. And among the social services that are there, they often are not sensitized to the needs of victims of gendered violence. In fact, victims in rural areas often believe that reporting intimate partner violence to authorities will make them less safe because it will increase the likelihood of further violence, and because legal authorities often favor the perpetrator. In Nicaragua, this has been the case, despite the fact that there was a law passed in 2012. It was a comprehensive law against violence against women. It's called Ley contra Violencia hacia las Mujeres, Law Against Violence Towards Women, that made violence against women a human rights violation. It increased the penalties for violence against women. It called for the establishment of domestic violence courts and called for improving the treatment of victims. It looks great on paper. No. However, immediately after the passage, the government began the process of watering down the impact of the law, including mediation in cases of intimate partner violence, despite the objection of women's rights groups. In some of the rural areas of Nicaragua, it was not clear that women even knew the implications of the new law or understood what this meant. So the New Haven Leon Sister City Project, which has been working in Leon, Nicaragua for over 30 years, provided a small grant to one of their social workers to go into Goyena, Nicaragua, a small village west of Leon. It is a village surrounded by sugarcane fields owned by a multinational corporation, which is pretty much the only place to get a job. The majority of the population lives below the poverty level, and there's limited electricity, limited water supply. And within that context, intimate partner violence is rarely documented, rarely reported to authorities, but we assume it is at least as common as estimates from Leon. So the New Haven Leon Sister City Project gave a small grant to start a women's project in Goyena. Proyecto Mujeres was a grant-funded program to provide legal and social knowledge to the women of Goyena to facilitate their access to justice and assert their right to gender equality. It was a series of workshops facilitated by the social worker, all discussion-based. It went on initially for 1 year. 30 women initially showed up and 16 attended for the full year. And in the workshops, they discussed the social construction of gender. They discussed domestic violence. They discussed reproductive health. They discussed the new law, and in fact, an attorney came and answered their questions about what the new law meant. They used theater of the oppressed there's a theater of the oppressed is a creative way to use participants' stories to talk about oppression. And when I went to Nicaragua, to Riena in 2016, they actually involved me in Community of the Oppressed and got me into one of the skits to talk about oppression. Okay. So after a year of doing this, there was very positive feedback. There was no evaluation at that point, but there was very positive feedback from the participants. This was clearly having an impact on them, and I've talked about this in other presentations. It was the positive feedback, however, inspired the New Haven Leon Sister City Project to start a second group in Troilo, which is another village not too far from Goiânia, and continue the discussion. I was interested, as a sociologist and criminologist, I was interested in evaluating the efforts here because I thought it was really interesting. But I thought two of the challenges were that it was a very small sample size, but the main problem for me was funding. There was absolutely no funding to do any evaluation of this particular type. Nevertheless, we persevered, and I met Maria last year. She was an intern for the New Haven Leon Sister City Project in Nicaragua. She spent time in Goiânia and developed, we worked together to develop a survey that could be used for evaluation purposes. Maria really created the survey, and I just kibitzed, basically. But we worked very closely with Arendra, who's a social worker in Nicaragua, and she was very excited about the possibility of doing the evaluation. The survey is really three sets of questions: demographic questions that include socioeconomic status, property ownership, and who lives in the home. A second set of questions are measurement of attitudes about domestic violence, including a hypothetical husband's controlling behaviors and the acceptability of a husband being emotionally, physically, or sexually abusive. And a third set of questions asks the participant about their own experience of intimate partner violence. The surveys we thought should be administered in May and June, which is actually the rainy season in Nicaragua. But if you're trying to get agricultural workers to fill out a survey, the best time is to get them during the rainy season when they're home. So we thought that would maximize participation. We had the idea of comparing all of the women in Goiânia and Troilo, which is about 30 to 40 women at this point, all of those participants from the workshops, and having them fill out the survey in the communal space. Every village has a communal space, and we thought that might be the safest place for them to fill out this type of survey. We wanted to compare them to women in small villages, either nearby or in Troilo, who had not taken part in the workshops, to see if their attitudes were any different and their experience was any different. We went through the IRB process and we got approval. We were all ready to go when the violence in Nicaragua started last year. There were protests, and the government started basically a very violent campaign to suppress the protests, and we decided it was not safe for us to go down there. Even though it didn't, the protests did not affect the rural areas as much as it did the urban areas, but still, we had to fly into Managua to get to the rural areas. So we decided to suspend activities for now. Currently, what we're trying to do is think about ways to continue the evaluation, because Maria and I are both in different places this year. And we've thought about recruiting social work graduate students from nearby universities to try to help us with the research, or interns with the New Haven Leon Sister City Project to see if they could help us out. These are surveys, so some women could probably fill them out themselves, but there's a variation in literacy. So we need to be able to actually do interviews with some of them. So we are up in the air as to how that's going to happen at this point, but we're hoping to do that this as early as this May, this June, so that's the game plan anyway. I want to leave you with two thoughts based on this research and based on my interest in this project. The priority theme for CSW63 is concerned with social protection systems, access to public services, and sustainable infrastructure for gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. Women in rural areas and developing countries have very few places where they can safely discuss intimate violence that they've experienced. The creation of safe space for them must involve not only education, but building trust and exercises in building trust and creative ways to help these women tell their stories. Disclosure and sharing of these experiences is clearly empowering for rural women, and it may help them to partner with social protection systems to create more sustainable solutions to intimate partner violence in this rural context. Second, I am very much wanting to continue trying to do evaluation of rural programming in this area. Most evaluation studies involve larger samples for statistical validity. This type of community-based educational programming could be a model for changing norms in small communities, however. Places where anonymity is low, places where the criminal justice response to intimate partner violence is weak. These smaller communities are operating under a different social context that includes greater unemployment and poverty, as well as closer ties to the community. There is a clear need for evaluation based on in these smaller pockets of the population, and the results may help the Women's Project and other similar projects to expand and continue as an instigator of social change. Thank you.
So we have the next speaker, who is Mr. Rob Street, who is from the UK. He works for a charity that funds research, and he's going to talk about getting girls' and women's voices involved in that process.
Thanks, Elaine. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, my name is Rob Street. I'm Director of Justice at the Nuffield Foundation. Is that any better? Yes? Good. Okay. Sounds off a little bit. I was going to say at the outset that I thought I'd perhaps be taking a slightly different tack from some of the other speakers, but I think already what I've heard from Laurie and Kalliopi is that the issues, the importance of the issues around data and research are central to what we're talking about today, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in my slot, with particular reference to a new initiative in the UK called the Family Justice Observatory. So first, a little bit, who are Nuffield Foundation? Well, we are an independent charitable trust that seek to advance social wellbeing in the UK through funding research and analysis in some three broad social policy domains of education, welfare, and justice. And it's all about funding research to develop workable proposals for reform, for policy and practice. So it's very much about putting research into practice. And our main focus is primarily on those who experience disadvantage or other forms of vulnerability. Now, we're a key funder of research into family justice. And just to clarify, by that I mean that part of the legal system which is to do with family law. That's that part of the legal system which deals with the processes and consequences of changes in familial relationships, particularly relationship breakdown, but also relating to the welfare and protection of children. So I don't know how well that kind of translates in all the different areas and jurisdictions I'm talking to today, but I'm sure you probably have something akin to that. So it's a key area for us. Why is it important to today's topic? Well, we've already heard, we know that domestic abuse, and I'm going to use the term domestic abuse, which is increasingly used officially in the UK. It still encapsulates issues of physical and sexual violence, but it also includes a broader definition of behaviours around coercive control, economic abuse, and harassment. We've already heard that we know it's a global problem. We know that the UN have estimated about 1 in 3 women will suffer from violence in their lifetime. The figures in England and Wales are similar, slightly lower. Is that okay? Okay, I'm back on. So we know the extent of the problem. We know that it's a significant and pervasive issue across a number of different areas of social policy. My slide there references a report released by the UK government a couple of months ago, which estimated that the cost of domestic abuse in England and Wales amount to £66 billion a year, which is primarily monetising the cost of the harm to victims, which, put that in perspective, that's more than the costs of drug and alcohol misuse in total. So domestic abuse, of course, is a crime. It should be dealt with through the criminal justice system, but its consequences often play out through the family justice system. It looms large in many family justice cases. We know that many divorces result from domestic abuse. We know that allegations of domestic abuse commonly feature in child contact cases after separation. And we know that thousands of children live in households affected, and they are affected directly or indirectly by domestic abuse. And many are taken into state care or under state protection each year because of issues around domestic abuse. So it is a very big problem for the family justice system too. The family justice system is one route by which some of the consequences of domestic abuse can be addressed. For example, victims can have non-molestation orders brought to protect them. But also there's a concern and a risk that some of the consequences of domestic abuse can be compounded through the family justice system. For example, women victims can lose their home or even care of their children sometimes, and children conversely their families, and access to financial support. And there's a lot of research out there reporting that women often feel they have to live with what are perceived as unsafe decisions around child contact after separation, or, as I said, they have their children taken into care. So there are some big issues that are kind of emerge from domestic abuse issues appearing in the family justice system. And there's some sort of additional challenges, systemic challenges around that. And many of you will probably know we've had nearly a decade of austerity policies in the UK. The impact of some of those have been significant cuts in funding for women's refuges, significant cuts in access to legal aid, which means increasingly that women and men have to represent themselves in court in family law cases. And that has led to situations sometimes where women victims have been cross-examined in court by their abuser, even though the government's now taking legislative action to stop that. So all these contribute to the further kind of feeling that these issues of domestic abuse are still playing out through the family courts. I mentioned earlier that domestic abuse is common. It's commonly alleged. There's sometimes some confusion because, of course, there's talk about high conflict cases and separation. A lot of separations are high conflict. That's not always the same as abuse. So do the terms get conflated and perhaps domestic abuse gets lost in the other definition? But the thing I really want to talk about for the rest of my talk is about knowledge and what we know about the topic. So we know that domestic abuse is no longer the hidden crime it once was, but I would argue we still need to know more. How can we understand the scale of the problem without good data? And how can we inform good decisions without good evidence? So that brings me on to talking about the Family Justice Observatory. Now, I know it's a slightly odd term, the observatory. Don't think about a sort of giant telescope in the desert. It's about having an extensive view of the system. And the Family Justice Observatory is a new independent centre. We thought it was important that it's independent of government, that aims to catalyse improved outcomes for children and families involved in the family justice system through making better use of data and research. It's all about knowledge to action. It's got an aim of positive system change as well as improving individual decisions. And so we started scoping the work in 2015 and we started a 5-year pilot last year. So it's still relatively early days, but it's up and running. We've committed to a collaborative approach, particularly between experts and practitioners, but also what's sometimes called experts by experience, people who are actually involved in the system. And the really key thing there is understanding what they think are the important topics to address. And we talked to children and families who were involved in the family law system during the scoping phase for the observatory. And a number of priority topics were raised. A very important one, though, was around understanding the impact of domestic abuse on children. Also, actually raised, I haven't put it in the slide there, but better ways of addressing, this is the point I was making earlier, better ways of addressing the victimisation of women in the context of domestic abuse, particularly around preventing child removal. This is this issue about law being felt could be done to ensure that women were not being penalised on the account of behaviour of their abusive partners. So, you probably can't see that if you're more than about 2 rows back, but don't worry too much about the detail of the wording. Just focus on the shapes and the arrows, because this is just showing you how we hope the observatory is going to work. The key thing is it's a system, it's a virtuous circle, I think. So we have system intelligence, we have priorities from people who are actually involved in the system, whether they're practitioners or system users, saying what they think the problems are, saying what we don't know enough about. That feeding through into decisions about what data we might analyse, what research we might synthesise. I said earlier that one of the key things is there's an awful lot of research out there that just isn't being used to its maximum potential. That evidence then gets translated and applied to individual decisions, hopefully improving practice, and along the way building a culture and capacity within the family justice system around a better use of evidence, which then feeds back into what are the priorities now? Have we addressed those priorities at least? And all the while, we'll be learning within the observatory kind of how we do this effectively. So we have a website, of course, but I won't linger on that. But if you are interested, do go and Google Nuffield Family Justice Observatory. So we are primarily a UK-based organisation, but we are looking at international research. I think there's a particular focus on research internationally from the US and Australia, but in time we may broaden that. So in the time left to me, let me pull it together. So the recommendations I want to make. When we talk about empowerment, we should be thinking about empowerment through knowledge and not just action. Now, the Family Justice Observatory, as I mentioned, is a new venture. We're still emerging. How it works is still yet to be fully determined. We are committed to considerations of gender equality and how the observatory works, and of course, we know that underpins everything we're talking about today. But I hope that these principles and ambitions will apply to the observatory, as I argue they should do to all organisations working in this area. So, firstly, this issue of prominence. So, wherever possible, we should be working to collect and better use data to understand issues around domestic abuse. And I think that's got an instrumental value because that helps us understand the scope and nature of what we're talking about, but also a normative one in that it's making the issue prominent, it's bringing it to light. And of course, we know there are lots of issues there, and just listening to Laurie's talk before, I think reminded us of the difficulties and challenges of doing this, but also the value of doing so. Secondly, issues of effectiveness. We should all be thinking about how we can better use research evidence to improve practice, to prevent domestic abuse and support victims. Now, that might be doing more scientific evaluations, or it might just be systematically collecting the views of those affected. The key thing, I think, is acting upon the results. And I think there's a particular responsibility on researchers and also to organisations like ours that fund research to think about how the work can be used and shared in practice. And that connects to the last point, which is around participation, although that might have been better entitled engagement perhaps. I think wherever possible, and again, I think this links to what Kalliopi and Laurie have already said, is that we should be involving those affected. Obviously, we need to be sensitive to the needs of what will often be a scared and traumatised group, but we should be involving the people, the children and women who are affected by domestic abuse, and thinking about what the research priorities are. And there's some good examples out there of using victims as peer researchers. There was a recent study in the UK to talk to other women about their experiences. But just on a lesser scale, more simple scale, we can all make sure their voices are heard. So collectively, I know that data issues are kind of quite a dry and technical issue, but they are vital if we are to seriously get to the heart, I think, of empowerment. And we can all use research and data better to inform those and empower those affected by domestic abuse. And of course, it will tell us in train what progress we're collectively making towards the CSW and UN development goals. Thank you very much.
So I'm delighted to be here and fascinated listening to the speakers that came before me, and I'm hoping that I will add to sort of the overall picture that we're painting this afternoon with some of the areas of focus that I'm looking to address. So these are the main areas that I'm hoping to focus on today, this afternoon. Any one of these would probably take the entire session or multiple sessions or all of that. So I'm going to try and be succinct and hopefully not have Dawn give me the hook before I'm done. But I'm going to look at the notion that, and many of you may well be aware of this, the notion that there is a growing body of evidence about the co-occurrence of violence against women and children in the same family. And that children who are maybe experiencing direct violence within their family settings, but also being exposed to the intimate partner violence of their mothers largely, but any caregiver. Also looking at how we take that knowledge and experience and translate it into system reform, program innovations, and what some of those look like, the benefits, but also the significant challenges of those. And then I think it would be remiss to not talk about in this context the impact of work-related trauma exposure for those who are working and exposed to the trauma of others on a very regular basis, how that impacts individually on the practitioners, and also how that impacts ultimately the quality of care to the survivors that we're working with. And then ultimately, I'll just conclude with some recommendations about improved practice, policies and practice consistent with the UN goals. So again, these are just sort of kind of highlights or sort of underpinnings of what we're talking about today. The notion that intimate partner violence and violence against children frequently co-occur. There's ample evidence of that at this point in time, with overlapping risk factors and dynamics among and between them. And how, despite, though, that growing evidence and the clarity within various studies and reports by government agencies and NGOs, intimate partner violence and violence against children are too often separated in training, in research, in policy, in practice, and in activism. So while there is that really significant understanding and knowledge, it doesn't always translate into how we coordinate those efforts and how we think holistically about those issues in all of those various domains. We also, and I think much the way Rob was talking about, we need to think about the notion of interdisciplinary, culturally relevant, trauma-informed services. And I would say as we think about all of that, it always has to be guided by the voices of survivors. Survivors' histories of violence, their historical trauma, their current trauma, and their experiences with systems that perhaps designed to protect and support have re-victimized or re-traumatized in their efforts. So survivors' voices are always fundamental to all that we do, and that I probably don't need to say that to those of us in this room. And then again, that the notion of being trauma-informed
really is sort of an overarching term that requires also being vicarious trauma informed. So if we're not able to address the exposure to trauma by all of us in our various realms working directly with survivors of violence and abuse, we're not going to be able to deliver the highest quality trauma-informed services to the survivors that we seek to do. So awareness is the first step. And there are ample reports that talk about a lot of what we've already heard this afternoon about the barriers to reporting, about the obstacles to victims of intimate partner violence, being able to leave a violent family setting, often returning, being threatened or fear of retaliation or fear of loss of custody of their children. And so they return to violent settings only to then expose their children to ongoing violence and to being victimized continuously over time themselves. One of the pioneers in this country was somebody named Susan Schechter, who really looked at this interrelationship between intimate partner violence and violence against children, and talked very significantly about how systems really need to take the holistic view and look at that as family-centered as opposed to woman-centered or survivor-centered or child-centered. And she said, to link the safety of children to the safety of their mothers is the goal. Trying to make mothers safe does make children safer and offers children their best hope for stability. So that we're not punishing, as Rob was saying, we're not punishing women for their own victimization that others on the outside looking in see as her failure to protect her children. And often women in those circumstances are really employing some pretty creative strategies to protect their children, even though they are staying in an abusive relationship. So that was one key awareness that, that was raised by Susan Schechter and then many others. And she went on to say, blaming a mother for being abused, for not leaving the abuser, or for not stopping his violence is simply counterproductive. If she does not have adequate support, resources, and protection for herself, certainly, leaving him may make it worse for her children, and concluding that the abused woman and her children need the community's help. So it needs to be looked at as sort of a holistic, community, family-focused endeavor. So improved practice requires the things that I've listed on this slide, and probably others. An examination of attitudes and a commitment to change. And by that, I mean there's sort of the institutional bias against women. Even in our current practice, wonderful programs that coordinate efforts and coordinate systems and disciplines under one roof and deliver services in a collaborative fashion, oftentimes there remains a continued bias against women in family settings where there is this co-occurrence of violence against children or children exposed to the violence to the intimate partner violence. And those attitudes really continue to permeate the obstacles that then are created in the path for the survivor. Cross-training and capacity building to effectively intervene and not re-victimize. So that really means taking a large look at kind of advocacy on a larger level, in addition to, and at the same time, we're learning from survivors about what they need in their individual circumstances within their individual families and frameworks. Also, we need policies that not only are in writing, but also actually translate into practice, but policies that address safety, health, well-being of women and children simultaneously. And that the interventions that are then created for women and children simultaneously are only as good as the assessments that are done to determine what their immediate safety and healing and justice pursuits are. So dual assessments then need to be family-centered, not just women-centered or children-centered, need to be family-centered in addition, trauma-informed, and focused on reducing potential further risks, further safety risks, and also additional trauma. So the complex, too loud? No. So the complex trauma that exists in family settings really requires a multidisciplinary team approach. And we've been talking some about that, and certainly in other sessions during the course of the CSW. But really requires trained professionals in a variety of different disciplines, professional disciplines listed here and others. And also this notion about survivor self-determination. And by that, I mean, we often have survivors, the underreporting, the access for survivors into the criminal justice system is really, I think, across the board, a very small number that actually cross that threshold. We've worked really hard to try and increase access to law enforcement response and have programs that really help to bridge that gap. But ultimately, if we only think about survivors as getting justice or pursuing justice within a formal justice system, then most survivors, I would suggest, will not achieve justice for themselves and their children. So we need to really support and empower survivors to engage their self-determination and to have their own personal definitions of what justice and healing would look like. That may include the justice system, but also in addition to. And that core services within a multidisciplinary team approach need to include coordinated investigations, dual safety and service needs assessments, and then collaborative decision-making and coordinated interventions. So these, I'm not going to discuss these in great detail because we have limited time, but there are a growing number of intervention models that have similar frameworks and can be adapted to different jurisdictions, different communities, different countries, and have done so. I've been involved for many years in the Children's Advocacy Center movement here in this country, in the United States, but that has expanded in many ways to lots of countries around the world. And all of these programs are really coordinated collaborative responses to try and address what I've been describing and under one roof so that we can really make those services as accessible as possible to the survivors and their families that need it. So the benefits are clear. You probably don't need to go through all of those individually, but that certainly lead to more positive outcomes. Building and sustaining these programs, as has already been alluded to, are real challenges for a whole host of reasons. But we need to continue in those contexts to have greater commitment and training and integration and skill building around dual assessments and support for the mother-child dyad and the family as a whole. So this is really just to reinforce the notion about the work-related trauma exposure that those working in the field really need to have awareness about the impact, the inevitable impact of that work on themselves, but also on the agencies and the programs that they operate within, and that they need to have individual and organizational strategies to address it, to ensure provider well-being, but also quality care of survivors. And so finally, just to conclude it, I thought I would do it, is to build those collaborative relationships, to develop cross-disciplinary training and policies that really speak to the importance of being trauma-informed and working with both women and children, prioritizing and building capacity for dual assessments and interventions, ensuring that self-determination that I was talking about just a moment ago, promoting the awareness about vicarious trauma and the individual and organizational responses, and to support the additional evaluative research so that we know that those kinds of practices are in fact bearing out the kind of positive outcomes that we hope for. Thank you.
Okay, so we're talking, the whole point of this session was really to talk about how we empower women and girls to deal with violence that they experience. And that's something I really want us to think about and talk about in our discussion session. And if you try and put in to Google searches pictures of empowered women, it's really hard to get pictures of empowered women. And one of the ones that comes up fairly consistently is this Rosie the Riveter image from the First World War or the Second World War in the UK. And actually, she's become quite an international symbol. There is actually a picture of Beyonce who poses as Rosie the Riveter, but it isn't free, which is why I don't have it. But it's very difficult, and you do trip into lots of dominatrix type pictures, highly sexualized images and pornographic images. So finding images of women who are powerful and empowered is hard. And that's something I want to think about. How do we get those images around violence against women and girls that actually become just part of our own mental imagery? We know what that looks like. Am I too close? Okay. So we have this powerful woman. She's powerful, she's wealthy, she's successful. But in the UK, she took a really big lot of criticism last year for standing up for her own rights. And I think that's also what makes lots of women anxious and nervous about standing up for their rights, because when you do it, you're going to get slated. So again, I think it's, I've got a t-shirt on that says "Courage calls to courage everywhere," which is a statement by Millicent Fawcett, who's a suffragette. And I think it's about us being courageous and taking and supporting one another when we get criticised for being powerful. So I just wanted that to sort of frame the what I had to say. I now can't see what I have to read because I've got my mic in my way. Okay, so the aim of what I wanted to talk about really was I want to talk about a research project that we did back in the UK, and that I did. It's an international research project. The lady in the red jacket in the second row, Judith Ryder, was involved with me. She's from the US. We actually want to make this a collaborative international project, which is around the conceptualisation of violence, and how do we talk about and conceptualise violence in ways that are quite specific and that are owned and named by women and not set in law and policy within a sort of patriarchal male framework, because I think that would be really important and powerful for us. So we wanted to be able to do this research to work with women to define what violence looks like, what it feels like, and whether the terms that we use to express violence against women, like violence against women, actually fit with the behaviours that are experienced and the things that people suffer. Our work relates directly to the Sustainable Development Goals 5 and 16, because we're really trying to think about new ways of approaching social protection and public services that can actually speak to the experiences that women have and really empower them. And we want to develop a deeper understanding of how girls and women experience violence in the family. This is against the backdrop, really, of a women's movement that has been extremely successful at raising the issue of violence against women. And I think that's the thing. It's not saying that we haven't done well. We've done really well. This is a big UN agenda. We're all here. We've done really well at it. It's now, how do we take the next step? How do we take control and ownership of this and not be victimised as we are, and as Janet was talking about, and in terms of when we raise the issue, how it gets dealt with. So around the globe, the violence in the home remains a really common experience, whether we're from a wealthy country or from a poor country. And that violence is usually multi-causal and multifactorial. But despite this, services deal with people, as Janet was talking about, in really linear ways, and they try and separate it out and try and separate out the experiences. And yet, people also, there's lots of debates now about talking about violence against women, but talking about violence against everyone within the home. And I think talking about violence against women isn't denying that violence happens to other people too. But violence against women is particular. It's estimated by the UN that of all women who were victims of homicide globally in 2012, almost half were killed by an intimate partner or family member. And that compares to 6% of men. Now, those experiences are quite different, and I think we need to own and continue to talk about those. National and international systems have set up really well and have been really helpful at naming the scale and scope of the problem. We also have public attitudes that we're beginning to measure and talk about increasingly, which continue to blame women and girls for the violence they experience. And those public attitudes are pretty constant again throughout the world. So in parts of Europe where people see women as experiencing quite a lot of gender equality, countries like Sweden, the attitudes against women and girls and that blame them for the violence they receive continue to be very high.
And that very much influences what then happens when we get into systems that Rob was talking about, for example, family justice systems, where in all of our heads we share and hold these attitudes which think that somehow women and girls are to blame. And it's about how do we move to a point where we begin to be able to tackle those public attitudes that we all hold and which are just embedded in the systems that we have. And I think this is one of them. This is one of the participants from our study who asked really, how do we get to be believed? And I think movements like the hashtag #MeToo and other populist movements have really started to talk about how do women and girls get to be believed and how do they get to name and own their experiences. And that's by all of us in the system, including the police and including others. Social workers generally will, we reserve judgment, we make judgments about what's right and what's wrong. So our study was based on a number of focus groups. It's a pilot study and we're looking to make it even bigger around conceptualising violence. And I was originally going to be doing this presentation with a woman from United Against Violence and Abuse who we worked with, but actually cuts in the system mean that her organisation couldn't afford for her to be here in the end with me today. Within the focus groups, we explored in detail what violent behaviour was, and we sought consensus and to establish the difference that people held about those views and teased out. And the second exercise asked people to talk about specific behaviours and place them against terms like violence against women. We sought to understand how participants shared meaning and where they differed, and we looked in detail about what does it mean, what does hit mean? If someone hits you, what does it feel like? What does it sound like? What do they do? Where do they put their body? Where is your body? We sought to really tie that down. And we've found participants asked us lots of things like, is this violent behaviour? And actually really illustrated in their discussions how violent behaviour is a social construct that is situated. It has given historical, social and cultural factors, and we really need to get to the basis of teasing those out and what they look like. And those are very much set by things like age, size, developmental stage, intention, harm, recklessness, ability, disability, mental health, and power. And we found that women talked a lot about power in a way that social workers and other practitioners didn't. One of the questions that was asked to us, and one of the participants who came from the community that she was talking about, also talked about how this was often raced and classed and had other structural features. And she talked to us about situations where social services and others will say, but this isn't really violence. And she described this situation where a brother follows a sister and he watches what she does and he reports back on it, and how that form of control is quite hard to get other people to understand what that feels like and how constricting and restraining that is, and to actually take that seriously. And she saw that really as being something that was based on racism, that was about, oh no, but that's your culture, that's not, that's okay. This highly contested nature of violence also translated into what people thought about terms like violence against women. And many women we found were really concerned about that term because they felt that it said that it was all right for them to be victims of violence because they were a woman. And it was really interesting to us how they interpreted that when Judy and I had gone with our own views, that somehow that was quite an empowering term. So it's about thinking about there being more than one way of doing something and actually listening to the views of survivors. And I think this is the key to it all, this power of voice, the authenticity of representation and the right to be heard. They're the words of Bell Hooks, from, I'm sure many of you will recognise them. So the recommendations that we came out with really from ours was that social and criminal justice policy should not be constructed or interpreted in such a way that it places responsibility or blame on the person subjected to violence to deal with or limit or ameliorate or solve the behaviour of the person who is violent. that girls and women should be directly involved in the constructions of terms which describe and define violent behaviour and which then later on become imbued in assessment frameworks and other things that are then used to judge them and the ways they behave. That girls and women should be involved directly in construction of those assessment formats, and that intervention should be devised with girls and women experiencing violence in the family setting in ways which safeguard them, and Janet was just talking about this as well, and that are actually realistic and meet their own self-determined needs, and they may be different from the ones that we might prescribe for them. Our work relates directly to those sustainable goals, and we would argue is a way to approach social protection and public services which actually advance gender equality and empower girls and women by actually using the terms and the expectations that they have. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Is that in developing countries, or is that in rural areas? Is that
Actually,
here?
and in Brazil. It's a joint organization. We're represented here and in Brazil. And we're starting a program focused on preventing violence against women and focused on teenagers. And since she's the one that was speaking about preventing violence,
I think it's. I think the programs that have had the most success are ones that have very open discussions about relationships, and they include like spaces where girls can talk to other girls, and spaces where boys are talking about intimate partner violence as well. So I know in my classes, I find it very helpful to talk about healthy relationships versus abusive relationships. So that we're very clear from the beginning what we're talking about. And just talk about, if you want to talk about prevention, talk about healthy ways to resolve conflict, healthy ways to end a relationship, healthy ways to have an argument. If you think about if you look at the literature on intimate partner violence and the kinds of things, the kinds of incidents that evoke and trigger a violent incident or a controlling incident, they're the same kinds of problems that come up in healthy relationships. You just resolve them in different ways. So giving teenagers the skills to resolve those kinds of problems may be preventative in some way. I think too, it's helpful to have a list of red flags. And they may be red flags that they've thought of and red flags that they haven't thought of. It's not just violence; it's controlling behavior that I think is the real red flag, and I think that throws off victims a lot of times, because he's not violent until they're married, or he's not violent until 2 years down the road, but he has been controlling and he has been emotionally abusive. So talking about the whole continuum of a controlling violent relationship, I think is helpful in terms of those red flags.
It's just, I'm a domestic abuse peer educator. I work in the UK, so I'm employed to work with young people. It's a team of work around preventative domestic abuse work, and we've got a model that works in Newcastle. So I'd be happy to speak to you about how that will work in the same for anybody else who works specifically with high schools. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions. So what I thought I'd do, we've got two that are really quite generic. So I thought if I would I'll ask the two of them together, and I'll ask the panel to respond to them. I will very quickly respond to someone said to me, you spoke about your work in the UK, but I didn't mention Northern Ireland in research or discussion. My apologies if I didn't mention Northern Ireland specifically. I was speaking pretty generically about the UK. But our work at the moment has only taken place in England, and we are looking to expand that work. As I said, it's a pilot study, but that's why I wouldn't have addressed particular areas. Okay, so one of the questions is, globally, we are increasingly focusing on the legal and policy frameworks, laws and conventions. Is the law the best alternative, and what else can we do, especially if the laws remain looking good on paper?
Maybe I could answer that, because UN Women does a lot of work in this area, and I agree with this point. And I think it's really important to understand that having a good law, it is really important in order to have the foundation and the framework, the enabling environment. And also, in a way, it also conveys a clear message to society that violence against women and girls is not acceptable. And we have also seen in some countries that the process that the women's rights movement they have been doing, developing this legislation, it has really helped to create some national dialogue around why violence against women and girls is not acceptable. So it has a very big value. However, enforcement of legislation, it's a huge gap at the moment. It's not enough to just have a good law in paper. We really need to have very solid enforcement, training of law enforcement officials who come. They are a part of the society, and they do carry the biases, the prejudices, the attitudes that the rest of the society carries. And very often, and still in many countries, domestic intimate partner violence is considered a private issue, and that survivors, they have to deal with it, to deal within the family setting. Very often, what you were saying about how they need to protect the children, and they need to make sure that they maintain the family coherence and to keep the family together. I think prevention, apart from the enforcement of legislation to address the root cause of such violence, is very important. And if I can add to what the colleague had just previously said, prevention is still a very young field, especially for violence against women and girls. However, we do have some basic principles that we know that they have been working. First of all, we know that we cannot have just one component prevention strategies. We need to have a multi-component prevention strategy. When we have an educational program, an intervention at school, it wouldn't work if we have just one or a few training programs for teachers or for students. We really need to link with community mobilization. We need to link with the Parents Teachers Association. We need to have a whole of school approach to addressing and preventing violence against women. We know that it wouldn't work if we have separate programs addressing women and girls separately from men and boys. Although there are some considerations, however, we know that now we need to work together to examine the power and control that Laurie had referred to before, because very often in these prevention interventions, it's not necessary always to discuss about violence itself. It's like, how is it power and control experienced and understood within a community? We are all human beings, and in certain ways we have all experienced power abuse and control, and these are the issues that they help as entry points. And I think it's very important what evidence has shown so far is having economic empowerment programs, for example. They could have been pretty controversial for some time, because they could create a backlash against women, because they shake up the gender roles within a society, making men feeling uncomfortable and insecure. But when they are complemented with gender transformative approaches, then we may have, in the longer term at least, some results. I understand that this is that was a longer answer than I intended at the beginning, but it gave me some.
Did anyone else want to say?
Yeah, I'll say. Thank you. I think that with laws, they're only as good as people being aware that they exist, number one, and number two, that in fact they are implemented and enforced, and that somebody holds the institution or the professionals or the systems accountable for if they're not. I mean, there is an example here of victim rights legislation in every state in the United States and federally. And yet we have a high-profile example of an offender who raped, sexually assaulted young girls multiple times, and there was a plea agreement outside of the knowledge and input from the victims. That is a violation of victim rights no matter what part of this country you're in, and yet it was allowed to happen. And there was no accountability for it. So that I think is number one. The other thing about legal, I mean, that's one piece of what I wanted to add to the mix. The other piece is something that I think has been a dilemma in the criminal courts here in the United States, and I suspect elsewhere, is the notion that women, in an effort to empower them to make decisions about whether they wanted to be part of or participate in the criminal justice system, that led to the abusers being able to use that as one more measure of power and control. So they knew that they could compel the victim, the survivor, to drop charges, to not proceed with charges, to recant a report of abuse, and that would be another way in which that victim was being controlled. And I think that's been a dilemma in the criminal justice system, certainly, because do we empower women to make those decisions for themselves? Or do we say, if a crime has been committed, the system needs to take responsibility for holding the offender accountable? So I think that is a dilemma that I don't think we'll be able to resolve right here today.
Okay, so we have got lots and lots of really good questions. There are some that are similar, so I'm going to group them. We have two. One that asks, in my country, we have a women's organisation that's dominant and entrenched in protecting their relationships with, I don't know what the CCC are, I guess the state maybe. So they are resistant. So there's resistance doing anything that would jeopardise their funding and relationships. And I'm sure there's lots of organisations that find themselves in that position. So this pervades the family courts where we have appointed judges who are misogynists. And how do we make change under these circumstances? The panel may have views. And the other person asks, I work with survivors of sex trafficking, and oftentimes the biggest impediment to a much needed multidisciplinary approach is resource scarcity. This is further exacerbated by data challenges. Government grants are often denied. How we're bridging the gap between grassroots and government organisations while maintaining the integrity of our work give quality care. And I think they're related, this relationship between resources, scarcity, and being able to impact on the system.
I can only speak from what I've learned from Arendra, who's a social worker in Nicaragua. She's also in the women's rights movement there. And the kinds of problems that they have are a domestic violence court, for example, that is basically packed with supporters of the perpetrator, so that supporters of the victim can't even get into the court. And so they have those kinds of problems. They have the problem that the police do not routinely patrol rural areas. So there's the social workers actually had to go out and get the police to get them to come and arrest a perpetrator before. I think their answer is activism and working together, coalescing around issues. They work together because they have to. The criminal justice system is not going to work for them The legislation they have looks great on paper. It's not that I'm saying don't have legislation, but it looks great on paper, but it's not being implemented in a way that makes any sense. And so what the challenge for them is to try to create safe space for women to talk about the violence they're experiencing so that they can empower each other to be active, to protest, to be safe as they're trying to protest, but to give each other inspiration and strength and to do it together so that a victim who goes to court goes with an entire group of women who may be standing out in the street, but they are standing out in the street very loudly saying that they're there to support her. So I think it's pooling your resources and trying to think about how do we create safe space, a safe community for ourselves.
Thank you. All right, this is one that I think lots of people may feel they want to comment on as well. Is do mothers tend to feel guilty and ashamed of their inability to protect children from fathers? Does anyone want to? I would say my research shows undoubtedly that they do. That they feel guilty, they feel ashamed, they are worried about raising the issue, that they are frightened of talking about that to agencies of social protection because they may become more in trouble for talking about it and about their concerns. But if they're not seen to acknowledge those concerns, then they'll be in trouble for apparently not acknowledging them. So they're between a rock and a hard place. I don't know if that translates for everyone.
I think it's even difficult to say it out loud within society or within family members because when people are not in the situation, like I've heard other women say, if she's stupid enough to stay there, but they don't get that people can't leave, or they're still even in love with the perpetrator and they're trying to protect her. So it's very much a silent story for a lot of people because they don't feel that people can understand. So they're living in guilt. They're living in fear. They're living in judgment. There's so much. So that's an answer to that. Yes.
And I think that people often look at what the mother is not doing to protect her children as opposed to what she is doing. And if we ask that question, more often than not, there are a list of strategies that she's employed for better, for worse, or whether all of them work or don't. But it's not like she's just standing idly by and allowing this to happen. I certainly sometimes that's the case, but more often than not, there are strategies being employed, and we don't necessarily ask what they are.
Okay, I'm gonna put this to the vote because there's two I think are particularly interesting. One is, what is the role of men in the process of building protection and justice systems? And Shekel's pointing at Rob. Do you want to take that, Rob?
Thank you for acknowledging.
Just remind me the question.
What is the role of men in the process of building protection or justice systems?
Well, I think it depends how you mean it. I mean, in some ways, men have the same role as women, don't they? And we have the right we should follow social norms and laws and support those who are victimised side of that. I suppose a lot of the systems we're talking about today, particularly sort of law and law enforcement, tend to be more male dominated. So there is perhaps a particular responsibility on men to make sure they understand many of the sorts of issues we're hearing about today in their both professional and personal lives.
Yes. She can take that.
I would like to say something about that because I understand it's a quite contentious issue, and you may have heard also very often in negotiations, since we are at CSW, very often we're asked what is the role of men and boys to address violence against women and girls. definitely very important. We should remember that not all men and boys are perpetrators of violence against women and girls. We have definitely some successful bystander interventions, and how you address toxic masculinity is very important, the responsibility of all of us to address it. I think it's very, very important. We've seen increased support to men's organizations as well. They really have to be accountable to women's movement, and also to be able and responsible to accompany women's organizations and the cause, instead of going against them in an isolated way. I think that would be very, very important as well. And also we need to have, when we talk about men and boys, I think also it's very, very important to have broader strategies where we do facilitate the change of gender roles within the family, the parental leave, the paternity leave, how men's increased roles and responsibility within the families and society for roles that they have been considered exclusively women's roles. I think that would be also very important for the transforming toxic masculinities. Thank you.
Sorry, can I just, Michael Kaufman from Canada, Jackson Katz from America is doing great work around that toxic, he talks about the bystander approach being anyone who witnesses even the language of putting another person down or a sexist remark, not a bystander in a fight in a street, but actually this cultural attitude that we all have about our genders. And so there are great men out there that are already doing this work. White Ribbon Campaign with Michael Kaufman. I'm Catherine Byrne from Women's Aid in Belfast, Northern Ireland. I didn't put that in about Northern. We don't have a government in Northern Ireland. We don't have coercive control. We don't have domestic violence bill. We don't have nothing. We don't have a childcare strategy in Northern Ireland. We don't have anything. So anyway, there's good men there. Are we done?
Okay, can I just thank everyone very, very much for all your contributions. We have lots of questions here we did not get to, and we will get back to you, but thank you very, very much.